Well, we're getting closer to the end of summer. Students got about one more month of summer vacation, about one more month until football starts. Those are really kind of like the two hallmarks of when we transition from summer to fall, the start of school and the start of football. Am I right? And with that, we are nearing the end of our series, The Extraordinary Through the Ordinary. Each summer, I like to go through a series where each week doesn't build on the prior, but each lesson, each message is able to stand on its own. As I know, many of your guys' summer schedules looks like mine. Chaotic, and you might not be here every week. And so we try to do something where you can come in fully understanding without being there the week previous, and that led us to going through this series, The Extraordinary Through the Ordinary, this summer. Throughout this series, we're taking a look at a number of different examples of God doing the extraordinary through the ordinary. I've enjoyed this because it's really just provided an opportunity to simply tell the story of some of the heroes of our faith. Some of the heroes of our faith who weren't priests, who weren't preachers, who weren't pastors, but they served in ordinary roles. They were the shepherds, they were tax collectors, they were mothers, they were fathers, they were, you name it. They were out in the secular workforce, and in the midst of serving in the secular workforce, God was doing incredible, extraordinary things in and through their lives. And the same holds true for us today, is that God is doing extraordinary things through the lay people, through those who serve in secular roles. God does extraordinary things through all who have faith, but more often than not through the scriptures, it's people who work in the secular fields that God is doing extraordinary things through. And so throughout this series, again, we're putting the responsibility of ministry on whose shoulders? On your shoulders, as God can do and will do extraordinary things through you. And so today, as we continue our series, we're talking about Daniel. And so let's set the scene for Daniel today. Similar to Nehemiah, last week we talked about Nehemiah. Daniel takes place within the period of exiles. Nehemiah took place near the very end of the period of exiles, about 100 years after the Jews were first able to return to the land of Judah and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah near the very end. Daniel takes place near the very beginning of the period of exiles. If you remember, the Jews were forced out of their land by King Nebuchadnezzar and his army. So the Chaldean Empire came in and conquered the land of Judah and forced the Jews to live as exiles in the Babylonia region. And similar to how Jews trickled from the Babylonia region back into Judah over a period of around 100 years, the same held true at the beginning of the exile period, where Jews were trickling in from Judah to this Babylonia region. There were a few major deportations of Jews from Judah to the Babylonian region. The first major deportation out of the land of Judah took place actually before the city of Jerusalem was even destroyed. And that's where Daniel comes into play. Daniel is part of the first major deportation of Jews from the land of Judah to the Chaldean Empire and this Babylonian region. And so we pick up, we're going to start right at the beginning of the book of Daniel. That's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time this morning, taking a look at the beginning of Daniel's ministry and how his life was set up, why he was there in the first place. And so in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, we read, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans." And so right here, to start off this book, verse 1 sets the scene during the reign of King Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim was the son of King Josiah. Many of us probably may be familiar with King Josiah. Josiah was the last good king that Judah had. Judah and Israel, they were a unified nation, but after the reign of Solomon, they split into the 10 northern tribes of Israel and the 2 southern tribes of Judah. The 10 northern tribes of Israel, they didn't really have a single good king. They were pretty promptly conquered by the Assyrians because of their disobedience. Judah was a bit different. Judah had more bad kings than good, but Judah had a handful of good kings who led them towards God. And King Josiah, when we look at the list of kings in the nation of Judah, he was really the last good king that the nation of Judah had that led the nation towards God. And now Jehoiakim, he was actually the second son of Josiah who ruled over Judah. Jehoiakim had a younger brother by the name of Jehoaz, who was made king by the people of Judah after their father Josiah died in battle. And so we aren't sure, we're not given the reasons why, but Jehoaz was the people's choice in who should be the next king after King Josiah died in battle. Now Jehoaz, he reigned in Judah for a measly 3 months. I mean, can you imagine a king only ruling for 3 months? If a president today, in our day and age, if a president only ruled 3 months in our country, we would already be on to our 3rd president of this year. And so Jehoaz's reign was ended abruptly as Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, came in and he took captive Jehoaz. Evidently, Egypt did not want Jehoaz serving as the king of Judah. And so they came in and they took the king and they said, all right, you're done and we're taking you captive. And the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, picked the next king of Judah, who happened to be Jehoiakim, the older son of Josiah, the king that Daniel's talking about here in verse 1. And so this nation of Judah, during the time of Daniel, the nation of Judah is experiencing a lot of unrest and turnover. Their last good king just died a few months prior, and as he died abruptly in battle, the people picked one of his sons to reign in place of Josiah. For hundreds of years, the people of Israel and Judah had a love-hate relationship with Egypt. Egypt's the one who held them as slaves for hundreds of years. But then after that, for whatever reason, the people of Israel, they frequently went back to the nation of Egypt for help. This was against God's will. God wanted them to seek God for help. But the people went back to Egypt time and time again for help and for deliverance. So they kind of had this love-hate relationship with Egypt. And so Egypt interjected, and they ended the brief reign of Jehoaz. It was then Egypt who picked the next king of Judah. I mean, if you were to put this in modern day context, imagine Russia or China coming in and forcibly ending the reign of one of our presidents, and then they handpick our next leader. Do you think that would go over very well? Yeah, likely not. And that's the sort of situation that the Israelites find themselves in during this time of Daniel. And this is all taking place while Nebuchadnezzar and his overwhelming army is at the doorstep of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar ordered his men to take captive some of the people of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar wanted some members of the royal family, and he wanted some of the finest youth in the land of Judah. So long story short, this is not a good time to live in Judah as a Jew. I'm currently, I don't really do many audiobooks. I'm currently listening to an audiobook of Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, revisiting that. And I could see some similarities between the Jews living in the time of Daniel and the Jews living during the Holocaust. In both instances, we see that Jews are being forced to relocate. They're being treated harshly by other nations, and they are being physically overwhelmed by a mighty nation. And so this deportation of members of the royal family, some of the finest youth and others, this was the first major deportation of Jews into this Babylonia region during this very unsettling time in the region, in the land of Judah. And so we continue here in Daniel verse 4. I guess we already read this, but we'll read that again. Youth without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Those last three guys, familiar with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And so we're dealing with Daniel and his three other companions here. And so Nebuchadnezzar instructed to take some of the finest youth through a 3-year educational program. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to assimilate these youths who were showing signs of intelligence, showing signs of brilliance, and he wanted to assimilate them into his own nation. That's if I were in Nebuchadnezzar's shoes, that's not a bad strategy. This is a good strategy to try and assimilate these impressive youth and bring them into your nation, following your religion, following your practices. And so the minds of these youth, they're very impressionable. No doubt they would be able to convert some of these fine youths through a 3-year educational program. And again, 4 of these youths are mentioned by name. Daniel, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their original names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so as part of this process to assimilate these Jewish youths and convert them to the way of the Chaldeans, they literally changed their names. They gave them new identities. No longer are you Daniel, but now you're Belteshazzar. No longer are you Hananiah, but now you are Shadrach. And the same for Mishael and Azariah as well, given new names of Meshach and Abednego. They're trying to give them a completely new identity so that they can completely convert to the new way of life within this Chaldean empire. And so we read in verse 8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And so the Chaldeans had this plan to conform the Jewish youth into the ways, into their own ways. And in this process, the Jewish youth, they ate the king's food and drank the king's wine. The Chaldeans here, they were not skimping on these impressive youth. They weren't skimping on the provisions made for these youth. A lot of resources were poured into them. And that makes perfect sense. If you're trying to win someone over, a great way is to spoil them and win them over by favor. And so Daniel was given some of the finest food within this empire, the food that belonged to the king, the wine that belonged to the drink to nourish himself. However, Daniel said, not going to happen. Daniel abstained from eating the king's food. Why? Because Daniel did not want to defile himself. Now, how would the king's food and the king's drink defile Daniel? The answer is we don't know exactly. There's a lot of different possibilities as far as how this could have defiled Daniel. One thought is that it's possible that this food was first offered to idols, and so Daniel rejected to partake because he rejected idolatry. I've seen in commentaries recommended possibly that this food was not kosher, that the Jews, they had very strict rules on what was clean, what they could eat, and what was unclean, what they should not put in their mouth. Others write a possibility that Daniel had previously taken a Nazarite vow, potentially. Nazarite vow is all about making yourself holy and separated from those around you, and part of that entailed not drinking wine, so maybe drinking of that wine would defile him in that sense. It's possible that the food and drink would have been served using temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar brought over and been taken to Babylon. It's also possible that Daniel simply wanted to make it clear that his allegiance was with Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And so we aren't sure, there's a number of different possibilities here, but we aren't sure why Daniel thought that the king's food and drink would defile himself. However, we do know that Daniel was taking a stand because of this thought. Daniel was not willing to conform to the way of the Chaldeans when he thought it would defile himself. I mean, at this point in Daniel's life, he's just a youth, so probably in his teens at this point in his life. And he didn't have much of a choice about being in exile in the Babylonian region. He didn't have much of a choice to leave his homeland. Daniel didn't have much of a say in what other people would call him. Certainly, the people over there would call him Belteshazzar instead of his original Hebrew name of Daniel. And so Daniel's not given a lot of choices here in a situation. However, this would serve as an opportunity for Daniel to take a stand, saying, no, I'm not going to partake of the king's food and the king's drink because that would defile me. And so we continue in verse 9 and says, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. And so Daniel here, he has this idea that no, he's not going to eat of the king's food and the king's drink. And so he brings this to the attention of the chief eunuch. Eunuch just signifying someone in a position of authority within their royal court, within their government. And the chief eunuch recognized that this was a very dangerous request. As Daniel was living as an exile, he doesn't really have many rights. He doesn't have many freedoms living as an exile in the land of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king was being gracious. He is being gracious by offering Daniel some of the finest food and drink to help conform him to the Chaldean way. And it's not polite, to put it in the most gentle terms possible, to reject this offer from the king. And so who knows how King Nebuchadnezzar would respond. It wouldn't be surprising at all to see Nebuchadnezzar get upset with this request, this unappreciative exile, and lose his patience with this exile. This very easily could have resulted in the death of Daniel. I mean, if we did not have our Christian faith, we didn't live by the morals of our Christian faith. You try and put yourself in Nebuchadnezzar's shoes, and you're trying to present your power and authority over these youths. And here comes an exile in his youth. He says, no, I'm not going to eat your food. No, I'm not going to touch your drink. That would defile me. We can see very easily how that would frustrate King Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, he has all these responsibilities on his plate, and I could very easily see King Nebuchadnezzar saying, all right, I'm done, I had it with you, go ahead, and we're simply just going to take your life, or we're going to kick you out, whatever the case may be. So this is a dangerous request Daniel is making. And so we see in verse 11, then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he said, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. So Daniel here, he's striking a plan with his overseer. His overseer would test Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and give them vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of these 10 days, their overseer would compare these 4 youths with all the other youths who continued to eat the king's food. And so essentially Daniel's saying, I have a proposition to make. Let's have a scientific experiment. I mean, it's very much a scientific experiment. They have their control group, those who would continue eating the king's food, and then they have the experimental group, Daniel and his 3 companions who would eat the vegetables and the water. And so we see at the end, verse 15, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So the conclusion of this experiment, we see that Daniel and his 3 companions, they were healthier than others. So moral of the story, eat vegetables and drink water. Okay, maybe not. That's not the ultimate moral, but hey, yeah, there's benefits in eating your veggies. Listen, you hear that, Kyle? Eat your veggies and drink your water as well. And so the steward took away their food, the king's food, and replaced it with the vegetables and water. It's not clear to me whether the there is referring to all of the youth or just these 4 young whippersnappers. I don't know. But they're taking some of the king's food away from some of the youth, possibly all of the youth, and replacing it with this new idea that Daniel had through this scientific experiment. And so closing out the chapter here, verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. And so here, with Nebuchadnezzar putting these youths to an educational program of 3 years. This educational program of 3 years comes to a conclusion. And so Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they stand before the king himself. I mean, can you imagine how daunting this would be as a youth? I can't imagine standing before the king who conquered my homeland as an adult, nonetheless as a youth. And these 4 fine young gentlemen, they were found to be 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were employed in the Chaldean Empire. And we see at the very end there, verse 21, that Daniel remained in the region until the first year of King Cyrus. Cyrus is the one who 70 years later would allow the Jews to return to Judah. That means Daniel stayed in this region for about 70 years at the least. That's the least amount of time that he could spend in this region, is about 70 years. Many assume that Daniel died at around this time in the Babylonian region, but we don't have clear evidence one way or the other. And so within these next 70 years, what in the world happened? What happened in the life of Daniel? Long story short, a lot took place within these 70 years. If we were to continue reading throughout the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters of Daniel, largely historical narrative, largely going over the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar, and those around them. The last 6 chapters, largely prophecy. But within these first 6 chapters, if we had the time to digest all this, we would see that Daniel lived through the reign of 4 separate kings. He lived during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, through the reign of Darius the Mede, and Cyrus. And during this time, during these 4 rulers, power shifted from the Chaldeans to the Medes to the Persians. And so Daniel's living within this land at least 70 years, and he's witnessing 3 separate empires having reign, having control over this piece of land. Now, under Nebuchadnezzar, this first king in the story, the king of the Chaldean Empire, Daniel rose to second in power after Daniel was able to provide assistance to Nebuchadnezzar by revealing his dream and interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 through 49 tell us, after Daniel was able to interpret this dream and vision, it says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, 'Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery.' Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court." And so under this king Nebuchadnezzar, took Daniel as a youth from his homeland, ripped him away from his home, brought him to this Babylonian region, and they're trying to conform Daniel to their ways. Daniel's saying, I'm not having that, and it's going to defile me. And as Daniel's growing up, he's able to interpret the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar realized, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings. And because of this work that God is doing through you, Daniel, I'm going to make you the ruler over the province of Babylon. So in this province of Babylon, no one would have authority over Daniel in this government other than King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Daniel rose to second in command within this province of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he eventually dies, and his son Belshazzar became king. Under Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Daniel rose to third in power in the empire. Daniel 5:29 reads, Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So again, we're still dealing with the Chaldean Empire, and within this king, King Belshazzar, Daniel rose to third in command, third in power within this entire empire. We fast forward in the story, and we see that Darius is the first king of the story who is the king of the Median Empire. And so we're talking about a completely different empire. And within this completely different empire, Daniel was one of three officials who oversaw the whole kingdom. Daniel distinguished himself above the other high officials. Daniel 6, verses 1 through 3 read, It pleased Darius, this king of the Median Empire, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, 120 different officials, to be throughout the whole kingdom. And over them, three high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So under this completely different king, under this completely different empire, Daniel rose to be one of three men in highest positions of authority. Not only that, but Daniel was distinguished himself between these other two guys as he had an excellent spirit within him. Daniel had incredible success within this region. It's a sort of success that's absolutely unheard of throughout the history of mankind. I'm no history buff. You'll have to ask John. But I can't think of another being in the history of mankind who rose to one of the highest positions of authority under the rule of three separate kings and two separate empires. It's unheard of, this incredible success that Daniel had. Within these foreign nations, Daniel inspired the leaders and their subordinates to worship the God of Daniel. As Nebuchadnezzar says, aha, your God is God of gods, and he is Lord of kings. Daniel had incredible success that helped him lead others to God. So God absolutely did extraordinary things through this man. This man who was simply a youth who lived as an exile, someone who would not have many rights or freedoms. And it all started here in chapter 1, when Daniel was unwilling to conform to the patterns of the Chaldean Empire. Daniel sought to stand firm against this process of conforming to this Chaldean Empire by not defiling himself with the king's food. It was an extremely dangerous stand to take. It was a stand that very easily could have resulted in the death of Daniel right then and there, and we would have never heard about Daniel thousands of years later. But God blessed Daniel in this firm stand. And God did extraordinary things through Daniel as a result. When we look at the life of Daniel, I think ultimately Daniel lived out Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Romans 12:2 states, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Under intense pressure to conform to the way of the Chaldeans, Daniel stood firm. And instead of conforming to their ways, Daniel transformed his mind through an ever-growing relationship with God. And so when we look at the life of Daniel this morning with an emphasis on chapter 1, I think we can pull out from this story, this lesson, to not be conformed to the patterns of this world. And today, very similar to Daniel, we have external pressures to conform to the patterns of this world. We have external pressure to have sex outside of marriage. We have external pressure to watch pornography. We have external pressure to get drunk. We have external pressure to value sports over church. We have external pressure to make our lives too busy for God. We have external pressure to live a mediocre version of our faith. And drawing from the faith, the courage, and the boldness of Daniel, we've got to stand firm. We've got to stand firm against this external pressure that the world throws our way. We cannot be conformed to the patterns of this world. For the gate is wide and the road is wide where many travel down that leads to eternal destruction. But the gate is narrow and the road is narrow to eternal life. But if we conform to the patterns of this world, you better believe we'll be walking down that wide road and that wide gate. It takes courage. It takes risk. It takes radicalizing our faith, radicalizing our lives not to conform to the patterns of this world. They could see, hey, this man Daniel, he's different. He's different. He's not willing to eat the king's food. He's not willing to drink the king's drink. He's willing to take a stern. And it was very blatant, it was very obvious that this man was rising above these external pressures. Do people notice you rising above the external pressures of the world? Is it obvious to the people around you that you are making a firm stand? That no, you are not going to conform to the patterns of this world? If yes, then you are well on your way. You are well on your way of God doing extraordinary things through you, just like he did with Daniel. The answer is no. There needs to be some examination. What needs to change in our lives? What stands do I need to make in my faith to not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of our mind, be transformed by an ever-growing relationship with God? And so if we follow in Daniel's footsteps and take that firm stand, I'm positive God will do extraordinary things through us as well. Let's pray. Father, you are full of love and patience. Father, I thank you for your patience in dealing with us, your grace and your mercy that you freely offer us. When we fail to make that stand, when we fail to refuse to be conformed to the patterns of this world, Father, I'm grateful, I'm thankful that you are still willing to work in and through us, allowing us to learn from our failures, allowing us to learn from our fallbacks, our setbacks. God, I just pray that you fill us all with the same boldness, the same courage that Daniel had to say, no, I'm taking my stand. I'm taking my stand as we do not want to defile ourselves, but we want to serve and we want to worship you, Father. You who are God of these silly foreign gods, you who are Lord of kings, master of all. So God, we thank you, we love you. It's in Jesus' precious and holy and powerful name that we pray. And all of God's church said, amen.